I've got some slides that I'm going to go through, and I want to talk to you about some things in terms of looking back to think about where we've been in order to look forward in terms of where we're going. But actually, before I do that, this banner at the front here, I just wanted to mention this banner. Is anyone else going to talk about this banner? Because I don't want to take anyone else's opportunity. No. So I had the absolute privilege of being there when young people were making this banner. So actually the edging of it's my edging. I've put the edging around the banner with lovely crayons. What's really great, I think, about the making of this is how when we're using creative activities with young people, it just gives us such a fantastic opportunity to have deep discussions with them. Because we haven't necessarily got to look at each other. We're doing something else at the same time. And that act of creativity really releases an opportunity, I think, for strong, powerful conversations that might not normally take place. And so it was my absolute privilege to be involved in the making of this, because I was able to have some powerful conversations with some of the young people at the same time as getting absolutely plastered in chalk dust, which for some people was difficult and for others was fine. So yes, I'm the Director of Children's Services at the County Council, and I've been in post for 7 months. And one of the really great things is that looking around the room, I recognise quite a lot of people. So that's good, because that means perhaps I've been spending my time effectively in terms of getting out and meeting the right people who are really committed to contributing to making a difference to our work and our work together. I wanted to start by having a look at what's happened in the past, because my presentation really is probably the most boring bit of the 3 days. It's the sort of strategic high-level bit, and there'll be other things that come in terms of presentation that will be much more interesting and engaging, because they'll be about the experiences of parents, of staff, of children and young people, and actually seeing some of the work led by children and young people, I think is going to be fantastic. But it is quite important to see it within the context of the legislation that surrounds everything we're doing. I'm really keen to make sure we all get to grips with legislation quickly, and then we translate it into something meaningful. Not something difficult that gets in the way of what we want to do and what we want to achieve, but something that we understand well enough so that we can use it to best effect and to benefit children and young people that we're here to support. So I thought it would be useful just to look back to what's happened over the last few years. I mean, pre-2001 actually, I think the first Code of Practice came into being after the 93 Education Act, so it was 94. And what was really interesting about that was it was the first time that there was something legislatively that required us to work in a particular way. And that duty to have a code of practice and then regularly revise it actually enables us to be where we are now. Not that we might not have done those things anyway, but the legislation pushes us, doesn't it, to make us do something. So 2001, that code of practice, I think, was interesting when we look back, because it was influenced primarily by schools and the local authority. It essentially was a code of practice for schools and for the local authority. But what it did was start to introduce, for the first time really, in terms of legislation, the need for an absolute commitment for education for young people with special educational needs to be of high quality, and for us to have high expectations in terms of outcomes for children and young people, and a high expectation of achievement of children and young people in school. And for the first time, it legislated for placing children and young people at the heart of our work. And that's why it's useful to look back, because hopefully we all think of that as just a matter of course now. Of course that's what we do. Of course that's how we operate. And maybe that's what we were doing prior to the Code of Practice anyway. But when it's legislated for, it means that there are things that we absolutely must do, and then it becomes embedded into our normal way of working. The involvement of children and young people in contributing to making decisions about their lives was first introduced in this code of practice. And there was also in it, for the first time, a real focus on preventative work, making sure that any issues were identified quickly and that support was put in place quickly and appropriately. And it talked about developing strong partnerships. So whilst the legislation had come through a route that was primarily about schools and the local authority, it started to introduce that way of working across partnerships with children, young people, parents and carers, with health, with voluntary sector organisations, with all sorts of providers, thinking together, working together and collaborating on providing the best support in a holistic way for children and young people. So I think the things that we've come to expect now, the impetus for that, the cultural shift, was in this first SEN code of practice. And then, you know, the things that followed, so this requirement to keep reviewing the code of practice, keep updating it, and ensure that it's informed by children, young people, parents and carers, brings us to where we are now. The 2014 Act enabled us to then have a revised code of practice, which was then updated in 2015. And I just want to have a look at that a little bit now. So what did that changed code of practice in 2014 give us? Well, it gave us the inclusion of disability as well as special educational needs. So we're all used now to saying SEND all of the time. Actually, we've only said SEND since 2014. Prior to that, the focus was still on special educational needs, and everything for disabled children was thought about in a legislative context in a different way. So it helped us to bring this together. I've already mentioned the focus on involving children, young people, parents and carers, but really focusing on their views. So the 2014 code moved on from the 2001 code, because it wasn't just about making sure that we talked to children, young people, parents and carers. It was make sure we really listened to what they were saying and responded to that in this holistic way. So it wasn't lip service, it was actually meaningful. I think we've still got quite a long way to go around some of that, and I'll come to that a little bit later. And then this focus on not just thinking about achievement, but really having high aspirations for our children and ensuring that we can all aspire to really great outcomes for them. Those changes also, for the first time, introduced education, health and care plans, and that requirement for services to work together collectively to ensure that for children, young people, their parents and carers, they weren't having separate discussions about separate parts of their children's lives with separate organisations, that we could try and bring this together and have a single approach. And I know that the system around that is progressing really well here. I think for all of us, there is still some way to go in making sure that those conversations, those holistic conversations, are meaningful and really well joined up. And that's not a criticism of anyone. It's just a recognition that this is still quite new to many, many, many services. The local offer was published. How bizarre to think that that's only been in the last few years, really. Again, it seems as though it's just part and parcel of what we expect and what we should expect to exist. The 2014 code introduced this graduated approach to educational support. So really thinking about what's best for each child at the right time in their educational career, and making sure that the approach to that was personalised and was graduated, with this focus all the time about successful transitions into adulthood. The further revision then came in 2015, and this was really important in terms of young people that may have special educational needs or a disability, but also find themselves caught up in the youth custody system. And that's a lot of young people, actually, who are in this particular group of youngsters, because for all sorts of reasons, the criminal justice system doesn't work particularly well for them. And so the 2015 code really enabled everyone that was working with young people who were involved in the criminal justice system to have better guidance and better support. The 2015 code also then introduced this requirement for schools to comply with the Equalities Act. So very specifically, not to discriminate within schools against young people with special educational needs and disability. There wasn't a lot of guidance around to support schools in what that meant in practice, but I think it's much better understood now, and that might be something we want to talk about over these next few days. And then the other things that were embedded in that 2015 update were there in the 2014 code, but just strengthened in the 2015 code. And this point about educational support being appropriate to need, but at the same time really aspirational. So this means, I think, really that we've got the legislative framework in place to require us to do things and to expect us to do things. But these events, I hope, are the way in which we move on to wanting to do the right thing at the right time for the right children in the right way, in the right place, with the right services. Not because we're required to, but because we want to. And our families should expect us to work together with them in this way. But essentially, we should all be wanting the same thing for all of our children, shouldn't we? We should all be expecting that they achieve really well in their early years. We should expect that they achieve well in school and college. We should expect that there is this focus on whole life outcomes for them, including preparation for adulthood and employment and access to employment and greater independence, so that ultimately, just like everyone else in society, our children lead happy and fulfilling lives. So in a way, this framework, this legislation, this code of practice enables us to have some focus, but it shouldn't really be any different than our expectations for all of our children. It's just about how we achieve it for these particular groups of children that have some additional need. So, looking forward to 2020, we've set ourselves this objective. Northamptonshire will be a centre of excellence for person-centred thinking and practice. And I've been thinking a bit about what this means. I've got a really good friend, same age as me, and he has cerebral palsy, and he went to school in Northamptonshire, and actually had a chat with him at the weekend. Sort of got these events coming up, and they look really great. But, you know, looking back and then looking forward, what sorts of things would you want to be, what would you want to see? You know, as a child that grew up in this system and who is now a successful adult, what would you want these events to be thinking about based on your experience? And actually, although he didn't use the phrase person-centred, but that's ultimately what it's about, he talked to me and talks to me a lot about the things that made the biggest difference to him in his life. It was having a fantastic teacher that believed in him, having fantastic support from his parents, having access to a friendship group that gave him fun and opportunities, and then the opportunity to have a great job and lead a fulfilling life. The expectation was there for him from childhood. And so I think our focus around how we achieve this centre of excellence actually is quite cultural. So I've identified these three things that I know you'll be looking at over these next few days. But culture, systems and structure, and practice, thinking about what those things mean. So culturally, what does it mean to be person-centred? Well, it's about being non-directive, isn't it? And it's very easy for professionals and all of my colleagues and everyone else in the room. I take the risk of really offending everyone as I'm about to say this, but it's so easy to be the professional, to know and to tell. And we need to get a cultural shift in place to really enable us to work with and work together. And the expertise that we have as professionals and the expertise that families have and the things that children and young people know about themselves need to collectively come together to make this cultural shift. And that means we all have to really believe in the potential and the ability for people to make choices for themselves. And so this is the point at which then I start to offend all of the parents and carers in the room. So I'm going to try not to offend anyone, but I will offend someone at some point. Because we love our children, don't we? And we want to care for them and we want to protect them. But actually, we also need to know that they have every ability to make their own choices for themselves about what they want from their lives and what they want now and today. Sometimes it's very easy not to allow that discussion to happen because we want to protect them. So we need to listen to each other, think together, share our ideas, not be afraid to think out of the box, say the unthinkable in a safe environment because that helps us to be creative and move on. And seek feedback. Is this okay? Did I get that right? If I got it wrong, why? What could I do better next time? And we need to have that conversation as equals around the table. So that's the cultural shift that I think we still need to do a lot of work to achieve because it's hard. In terms of systems and structure, simplifying wherever possible. I was just having a conversation immediately before coming up onto the stage with a colleague, talking about pathways and simplified pathways. We were talking about autism specifically and how difficult it is to simplify something that's very complicated and complex and to simplify something where every child is a unique individual and will have a different need. And so trying to find a simple way to reflect all of those individual needs is a really hard task, but it's something we really need to work at because we can fall into a trap of making things very complicated sometimes when they don't need to be. So simplifying wherever possible is really important. Enabling single conversations. I don't know how many years now we've talked about, tell us once, say it once, all of those things. Again, it's really hard to achieve it, isn't it? Sometimes a system can be created, but it's a system that people don't use. Sometimes people want to have conversations in different ways than we've planned. So being able to get underneath this and have some further discussion about it's really important. Co-locating staff in multi-professional teams. So in Children, Families and Education Department, as we move through this year, we will be restructuring our services. And I always worry about restructuring because, that old cliche of moving the chairs around on the deck, is always a concern. But actually, in order to do all the things that I've just described, I need to have my professionals working together in teams together, having multi-professional conversations, not in their own separate service silos. That's not a criticism of that way of working to date. But the only way we can simplify and have single discussions ourselves as professionals is by being located together, being able to do that easily. And then we want to really think about how we then broaden that out so that we can have those single discussions in localities with schools, with other partners, and with our families. We also need to be flexible and agile. So once we've planned something and we've set everything up in its boxes and it's easy to describe, we've got to be able to just work outside of that sometimes, haven't we? Because things don't always fit precisely in a box in the way that it's planned. We need to be able to be brave enough to work slightly outside of those systems sometimes to find the best route to do the most sensible thing in a quick and helpful way, whilst at the same time complying with all of the legislation and all of the legislative requirements. So none of this is easy, is it? But collectively, we can find solutions. And then making the system work for the individual, not the other way around. That's what all of this is about, everything that I've been describing. And then finally, to achieve that objective, practice caring about the hopes and dreams of each individual child and young person, and really wanting to enable those hopes and dreams to be achieved. Doing the with, not to. So this is the same thing that I was talking about in a couple of slides ago, how we really shift that culture to work with each other and not do things to each other. Bringing respect into our conversations, and that respect for choice into those conversations is also a really important part of our practice together as professionals, with our families, with children and young people, with the wider providers. Choice and the ability to make choices has got to be at the root of what we're trying to achieve. And then finally, relationships. All of this is a relational piece of work. So whatever the systems and the structure, whatever the legislation, in order to achieve that objective, this is about how we work together respectfully, how we bring energy into our relationships, how we bring professional trust and respect into our relationships, and how we accept that those relationships are forever changing and are dynamic. So I think that's why these next 3 days and the 4 events are going to be really exciting, because this is exactly what you'll be doing over the next few days, considering all of these things that I've just described, thinking about how we work together, thinking about how we focus our attention on achieving that 2020 objective. So, I'm looking forward to us achieving that in 2020. I think that I would really encourage you to take the opportunity over these next 3 days to really make the most of every moment of the time, because you're giving up a lot of time. This is a very precious space, and each of these 3 days and the 4 events are a very precious moment that we have to grab to get the best out of it, to enable us to move forward. I know that's what you've come here to do. And I really appreciate the fact that you've all given up time to come here, because everyone's very, very busy. What we've got to be absolutely certain of is that we use the time really well to make sure that we can move on in terms of our ambition. So, saying that, I know that your next speaker is going to be able to really start that off with lots of great experience, personal experience, and to be able to provide you with a lot of additional things to think about. So thank you for allowing me to introduce the event today, and I hope you have a really great time.